Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Eliza Townsend. I am the Maine Conservation Policy Director for AMC. And tonight's webinar is focused on an issue that could not be more important or timely: Maine's Climate Action Plan. We're living now with the effects of climate change. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. All of Maine experienced prolonged and severe drought in 2020, and the Maine Forest Service put out a record 1,100 forest fires. AMC's own research department has documented the impact of climate change on winters, especially here in the Northeast, finding that winter is trending shorter, warmer, and with less snow. Our iconic moose is threatened because winter cold is no longer enough to kill the ticks that feed on them. We must act. In 2019, Governor Janet Mills assembled a 39-member Maine Climate Council charged with developing a 4-year plan to put Maine on a trajectory to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by the year 2030, 80% by 2050, and to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2045. The Council's report, titled Maine Won't Wait, was released in December. We have followed the work of the Maine Climate Council quite closely, especially the Natural and Working Lands Working Group. Among the recommendations that I think would be of interest to AMC members are to increase Maine's amount of conserved land to 30% by the year 2030, to fund the Land for Maine's Future program, and to establish a voluntary incentive-based Maine forest carbon program. These recommendations are consistent with President Biden's recent executive order to conserve at least 30% each of our lands and waters by the year 2030. Now, the hard work of implementing the plan begins. There will be a role for each of us in ensuring that Maine takes the necessary steps to slow and adapt to climate change. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations. We're very fortunate to have as our guest tonight Cassaundra Rose. Cassaundra is a senior science analyst and the Climate Council coordinator with the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. She has more than 10 years of academic climate research experience with expertise in long-term shifts in terrestrial and oceanographic environments and their variability. She holds an MS in geology from the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD in Earth and Environmental Science from Columbia University. One of her favorite hobbies is hiking up and down big mountains, especially where there are interesting rocks to look at. So welcome, Samantha. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Eliza, and thank you everybody for having me here today. I'm happy to be here to talk with you about our new state climate action plan and some of the strategies that I thought would be of interest to you, and also a good dose of climate change science, because I'm a geoscientist and climate scientist by training, and I've always got to introduce a little bit of the science into all my presentations. So I hope you enjoy. So hopefully you can see my full screen slides. Eliza, can you confirm real quick?
Okay. Yes, we can see them.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so yes, as Eliza very kindly introduced me, I'm the Climate Council Coordinator and Senior Science Analyst from the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, in the Future. And I'm really happy to be here this evening to talk with you. So we're here today to talk about climate change, but first I want to acknowledge the COVID-19 crisis that we've been facing in our communities and as a nation for over a year now. The pandemic continues to be front of mind for all of us, and it can be tempting to push climate change to the back burner as sort of a long-term issue. COVID-19 is not a result of climate change, but it is a tragic example of the kinds of multiple overlapping crises that communities and states will face in a climate-altered world. These crises cannot be ignored, and neither will be solved without collective action. Furthermore, like COVID-19, climate change has outsized negative impacts on people with the least means to protect themselves, especially poor and marginalized communities. The Maine Climate Council was tasked with ensuring that our most vulnerable communities are prioritized and the benefits of new policies and programs are equitably distributed in the planning of the State Climate Action Plan. When Governor Janet Mills came to office in early 2019, she made tackling climate change a high priority for her administration and has taken very bold action in her first 2 years to support renewable energy and energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and reducing hydrofluorocarbons or super greenhouse gases, for just a few examples. Maine also joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, a bipartisan coalition of 25 U.S. states committed to meeting the Paris Climate Agreement goals in Governor Mills' first year of office. And we're really happy to see that the United States is going to be rejoining very shortly as well. So from increasing land and ocean temperatures to rising sea levels, more severe storms, acidifying ocean waters, shorter winters and disrupted agricultural seasons, and much more, including more prevalent public health risks, climate change is already a reality for Maine and the world. As a climate scientist, as I mentioned, I always try to fit a little science into my presentation. So I wanted to start by talking about what are a few of those impacts that we already see today and what we can expect into the future. So to help provide context for the Climate Council's work in its 15-month process, the Maine Climate Council's expert scientific and technical subcommittee worked to identify the impacts on Maine from climate change in their exhaustive 370-page report, A Scientific Assessment of Climate Change and Its Effects in Maine. I'll be reviewing some of those major impacts today to start you with a brief overview of how climate change is already impacting us here in Maine, and may impact us in the future if we don't act quickly along with the rest of the world to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and minimize warming. So to give you some context for why climate change is a major issue affecting Maine and the globe, I wanted to start by looking at our carbon dioxide record. CO2 is a major type of greenhouse gas. I apologize, my cats really want to hear this presentation. CO2 is a major greenhouse gas leading to warming and ocean acidification. And emissions from burning fossil fuels have caused CO2 and other greenhouse gases to go up dramatically in our atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s. Probably this is very familiar information to all of you. About half of the CO2 emitted since the 1850s has gone into the atmosphere, with the rest being absorbed by our ocean and our land-based sinks like our forests and soils. So in May 2019, atmospheric CO2 levels at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii hit their highest level in recorded history at 415 parts per million. That was the highest since we began recording CO2 directly in the air since the late 1950s, and much higher than anything that we had been able to tell that we'd observed before then as well. Last year, we exceeded that amazing record by over 2 parts per million, hitting 417 parts per million. Excuse me. And this year, we expect that record will be exceeded again as well. So what we've been able to observe is that the rate of CO2 is rising ever faster as we move forward through time, which is very concerning for keeping our warming down to reasonable levels. So if we look beyond the 1750s, even further back in time, to the very earliest records we have of CO2 in Antarctic ice cores going back 800,000 years. So to orient you in this timeline on the right, going back in time is to the left, and 800,000 years ago is all the way to the left here. We can see that CO2 has generally stayed between 180 parts per million during our ice ages, our cold periods, and about 280 parts per million, even during the very warmest periods of time. Global temperatures follow this pattern very closely, with warm periods happening when CO2 is higher and colder when CO2 is lower. It's only since humans began burning large amounts of petroleum from fossil fuels that are essentially fossil carbon accumulating over millions of years, that CO2 began spiking really much higher in our air than anything previously observed in ice core records. And today, we're all the way up here, over 50% higher than anything we've been able to observe from ice core records over the last 800,000 years. And paleoclimatologists estimate that the last time Earth had CO2 levels this high was over 3 million years ago, when global temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher or warmer, and sea levels were over 60 feet higher. So a pretty different kind of world than humans have lived in that we have today. So what does this mean for Maine? Well, to simplify things very broadly, temperatures globally and in Maine are increasing because of rising greenhouse gases, leading to more trapped heat in Earth's climate system. And while temperatures globally have increased about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, Maine's land temperatures have increased about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895, with our coastal areas warming more than the interior of the state. Of all the seasons, winters in Maine have warmed the most, which has caused our agricultural season to increase by about 2 weeks, and earlier lake iceouts and snowpack melt in the spring. Warming temperatures can bring some potential benefits from longer growing seasons and lower heating costs, but also potential damages like heat stress to workers and crops, more variable spring and fall weather, and damage to livestock, as well as greater cooling costs from our warmer summers. When we asked members of the public last summer about what they've noticed from climate change, many people told us that they've noticed over their lifetimes that Maine is warming up. And this includes people who've been gardening and growing for 50 to 60 years, to young people only 20 to 30 years old. Climate models suggest that Maine may warm an additional 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050, so 30 years from now, the end of my mortgage, and perhaps up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100, depending on the success that people have globally in curbing our greenhouse gas emissions. The spread here is really dependent on the choices that we make as a society. In addition, the Gulf of Maine has also exhibited significant warming along with ocean waters around the world. This continued warming of our ocean waters will result in additional warm water species moving from the south up into Maine, and fewer subarctic species in the Gulf of Maine. A kind of ecosystem shift that would have substantial negative impacts on our marine resources and coastal communities, as well as some important industries like commercial fishing and aquaculture that depend on knowing what having stable species and stable ecosystems. So Maine's environment is likewise affected by climate shifts. From our plants to all of our animal species, insects, and invertebrates. And up to 2/3 of our Maine's plants and animals, habitats, and at-risk species are either highly or moderately vulnerable to climate change. If warming does remain unchecked, our most sensitive plant and animal species on land and at sea are expected to shift their ranges further northward in pursuit of their preferred environmental conditions. I know I don't like it to get too hot, so I might want to move to a cooler climate if it's getting a little bit too warm for me to handle. So here in Maine, we have some unique environments in locations at higher altitudes like Mount Katahdin, And for example, cold water streams and fish that depend on having cold water year round that may disappear with warming because the species there may not have anywhere else to move once they reach the top of the mountain or once a stream warms beyond their preferred range. Warming is also causing Maine to become wetter overall, with our statewide precipitation, rainfall, and snowfall increasing by about 6 inches since 1895. So with greater warming can also come more unpredictable rainfall and snowfall, with both short-term droughts like the drought that we experienced last summer, spring and summer, and more frequent severe storms striking without much warning. So this is an increase in the variability of our climate, as well as a change in long-term trends. So heavy storms of 2 to 4 inches of precipitation are becoming more frequent, which increases the probability of floods that will erode infrastructure and degrade water quality in wells and public water sources, ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, and coastal areas. The picture on the screen here was taken in July last year near South Bristol, Maine, after 3 to 5 inches fell in the area in 24 hours. We're starting to see increasing numbers of really severe storms with a large amount of rain falling in a short period of time here. I've only lived in Maine for 3 years, and even I have been able to notice that there are some pretty unusual rainstorms that are getting more frequent.
So, Cassie, it doesn't look like you're sharing your screen at this point. I can't see it.
Oh, apologies.
Or maybe
I'm
that's just
seeing
me.
it, Bill.
You can see it? Okay, that's
Yeah.
me. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, well, hopefully you can get that back. I guess if anybody else
Okay, I've got it.
not see it, then let the participants know. Thank you. I'll do my best to describe. So 2 effects of warming oceans are melting sea ice and rising sea levels, of which the latter in Maine is accelerating. About half of the last century's sea level rise in Maine has occurred only since the 1990s. So the pace of sea level rise is beginning to increase as our oceans warm and land-based ice sheets melt. As Maine's relative sea level rises, coastal communities and ecosystems alike will see an increased frequency of nuisance flooding. So inundation of coastal lowlands, of saltwater erosion, and the potential loss of dry beaches, sand dunes, and other habitats. The picture on the right here was taken last November by my colleague in Portland on Franklin Street, when king tide flooding inundated the street by rising up the storm drains from Casco Bay. And based on scientific projections, the Climate Council is recommending that the state commits to manage for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 3.9 feet of sea level rise by 2100, but also to be prepared to manage for a potentially higher scenario. So potentially up to 3 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 8.8 feet of sea level rise by 2100. This is dependent on how the Earth's system is responding to that warming from rising greenhouse gas emissions. So the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Climate Council is closely monitoring this in particular. So climate change will affect all sectors of Maine's economy, from tourism, agriculture, and forestry to transportation and trade. Warmer temperatures, more rain, and sea level rise will increase the incidence of flooding and damage to property and infrastructure. However, there are opportunities that we should be able to take advantage of to grow Maine's economy while also becoming more resilient to climate change, as I'll talk about in a few slides. So where do our emissions actually come from in Maine? This slide shows you the primary sources of gross greenhouse gas emissions in our state. Maine's a little unusual in that we have a really high proportion that comes from transportation, over 54%, with the remainder really coming from heating and cooling of residential and commercial buildings. So between transportation and building heating alone, over 3/4 of Maine's emissions are coming from these sectors. In a moment, you'll see that a number of the proposed strategies in Maine's new climate action plan aim to reduce our reliance on the combustion of fossil fuels through both increased efficiency and weatherization, and by electrifying transportation and building heating and cooling. So the Climate Council was directed by the Maine legislature to achieve several goals in its climate action plan. Those include reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. And this is our gross or our total greenhouse gas emissions, not the net or the balance of them. In addition, Governor Mills signed an executive order requiring that the state achieve state carbon neutrality by 2045. So that means our gross greenhouse gas emissions, what we're putting in the air, should match what we're burying or sequestering in our land and coastal and marine habitats. In addition, the plan needs to ensure that Maine's people, industries, and communities are working towards becoming more resilient to the impacts of climate change. That legislation required that this climate action plan be delivered by December 1st of last year, which we were really happy we were able to do. So who is the Climate Council? The Climate Council consists of 39 members appointed by Governor Mills, and 6 working groups and a scientific and technical subcommittee. This group of different council members and subgroup members included more than 230 Maine people with a diverse set of experiences and backgrounds to develop the climate action plan. To our knowledge, this is the largest, most inclusive state climate planning effort in the United States. As part of the plan, a new equity subcommittee has also been created that will support the planning and implementation of climate strategies to ensure that the benefits of the implementation are distributed across diverse populations of Maine people and aren't specifically affecting some groups more than others. So the Maine Climate Action Plan had 4 big goals that it needed to hit during its development. I think chief among them really is ensuring that we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, which are the source of climate change. The plan also needed to make sure that Maine is more resilient to the impacts of climate change and is planning for those impacts. It also required that we foster economic opportunity and prosperity to ensure that we're not causing a major decrease in economic opportunity and activity as we're trying to make our industries and our ways of living more have a lower reliance on fossil fuels. In addition, the legislation creating the council required that we try to advance equity through Maine's climate response as much as possible. So the Climate Council was launched in September of 2019 by Governor Mills, and the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and working groups met monthly and sometimes even more frequently between October of 2019 and June of 2020 to describe the impacts of climate change in Maine and suggest strategies to reduce our emissions and adapt to those impacts. So the STS and the working groups all produced reports that helped inform the 39 members of the Maine Climate Council to select strategies to go into the Climate Action Plan. Once they made their recommendations to the council members considered the strategies in the context of a number of robust scientific and technical reports to select the final strategies, which I'm going to tell you about on the next slide. So as I mentioned, we had several scientific and technical reports that really helped guide the Climate Council members to understand the potential impacts and costs and benefits of the different strategies recommended by the working groups. So the SPS, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is charged with providing a summary of what those climate impacts are in Maine as well as some specific projections like estimates of sea level rise in Maine. So they produced a scientific assessment of climate change in September of last year, and they produced an initial report in early 2020 to help inform the working groups as they researched potential strategies. My office also engaged an expert consultant to provide economic analysis and greenhouse gas modeling of the draft strategies from the working groups. So trying to understand what's the bang for our buck with a particular strategy for reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and what are the costs and benefits of different strategies. In addition, they produced vulnerability maps to some of the major impacts of climate change, as well as an estimate of the cost of doing nothing more, or the cost to the state from climate change with current policies with no additional policy development on top of that. We also worked with the University of Maine's Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions to assess the recommendations of the working groups from an equity perspective. And for each strategy, the assessment sought to understand how it would affect vulnerable populations, climate change vulnerable populations, and to suggest improvements that would improve the equitable distribution of benefits. My office and the Governor's Energy Office also developed a plan to identify different pathways and strategies for the advancement of Maine's clean energy economy, which was a requirement of legislation creating the Climate Council and a big part of the plan. So this covers sectors like renewable energy and energy efficiency, among many others. There is a lot of great detail and information in the reports, several of which I edited. So I highly encourage you to visit climatecouncil.maine.gov. They're all downloadable and freely available for reading. So on December 1st last year, the Climate Council presented the final report to Governor Mills and the legislature in a kickoff event that included such illustrious folks as Special Climate Envoy John Kerry, members of our congressional delegation, and leadership from our state legislature. This report has received over 10,000 page views on our website so far, which is a lot of traffic for a government report. So there's a lot of interest and energy and excitement to begin putting this plan into action. So moving forward, going back to our timeline from December of last year, the Climate Council and working groups will be monitoring implementation of the climate plan, meeting with the Climate Council meeting quarterly and working groups at least twice per year. Climate Council met for the first time last week for the year, and they'll be meeting on a quarterly basis, which you can find on our website. The Equity Subcommittee has a little bit more of a unique role this year by making recommendations on major areas of climate programs and activities to ensure equity, advising on ways to better engage stakeholders, and making recommendations for equity outcomes to Climate Council strategies and goals, and helping us to identify some metrics to track progress. So moving forward, the plan is required by legislation, by law, to be updated every 4 years, with the next update coming in 2024. And this ensures that we're continuing to tweak and adjust the climate planning process to make sure that it's continues to be the right fit for Maine, and that we're responding to climate change as it progresses. So what's actually in this big plan that I've been talking a lot about? Well, it includes 8 primary strategies that both tackle lowering our greenhouse gas emissions and resilience to the impacts of climate change. The first 3 strategies on the left-hand side, which include embracing the future of transportation in Maine, modernizing Maine's buildings, and reducing carbon emissions in the energy and industrial sectors through clean energy innovation, really address reducing our gross greenhouse gas emissions, which in these 3 sectors account for over 80% of our emissions. The remaining strategies really tackle topics including broad resilience, but also sequestration and education and workforce opportunities related with climate change action. So strategy D, growing Maine's clean energy and economy and good jobs and protecting our natural resource industries. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. Strategy E, protecting Maine's environment and working lands and waters, promoting natural climate solutions and increasing carbon sequestration, has a lot in it that I think will be relevant and of interest to this group here. And the last strategy that I'll be highlighting particularly today is strategy F, building healthy and resilient communities. So strategy D, growing our clean energy economy and protecting our natural resource industries, really seeks to help grow our clean energy economy and support our natural resource industries, adapt to climate change, and be part of the solution for lowering greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering carbon. It recommends actions to grow, for example, our forest products industry sustainably, support sustainable forest product management, and forest management, and the preservation of natural and working lands, both to preserve scarce working lands, to help them be part of the solution for reducing or sequestering emissions, and to help our natural environments adapt to climate change. Plus, it seeks to establish the University of Maine as a coordinating hub for applied research that will really help inform our forestry, agriculture, natural land related managers and industries, like R&D of climate-friendly wood market innovation and climate-friendly agricultural practices. Strategy E seeks to help protect Maine's natural and working lands and waters from climate change and development, which can harm their ability to help Maine achieve our biodiversity and carbon neutrality and sequestration goals. So there's a lot in here, drawing from both our natural and working lands and coastal marine working groups, as well as the scientific and technical subcommittee reports. So a few recommendations I wanted to highlight here were particularly under the action area of protecting natural and working lands and waters. Maine's forests and carbon and coastal marine areas are large sinks for carbon, but they can be better optimized and improved through careful management and preservation. This strategy established a 30 by 30 goal of preserving at least 30% of the state's natural and working lands and waters by 2030, recognizing that these areas are great potential carbon sinks as well as areas where biodiversity needs to be preserved. These are unique assets that we in Maine have to offer, and we have quite a large forest habitat in particular that can help. So this includes also funding the Land for Maine's Future program and other areas to support sequestration, biodiversity, and preserving scarce resources like prime agricultural soils and working lands. Governor Mills also just signed an executive order to launch the Governor's Forest Carbon Task Force, which is under this sort of second action area here. A stakeholder initiative that will recommend strategies to incentivize climate-friendly forest management practices. So there's a lot in there. Highly recommend taking a look at the climate plan to see more details. Strategy F recommends broadly to provide state support for communities to be proactive about understanding, planning, and acting to reduce their risk from climate change. Importantly, it also underlines the use of sound scientific data to inform updated land use regulations, laws, and practices for climate change impacts. One prominent recommendation that I wanted to point out in the strategy, is the incorporation of sea level rise projections into regulations by 2022, with regular updates to ensure that projections utilize the latest scientific data on sea level rise. In addition, there's the development of a more robust public health monitoring as a recommendation under this strategy, which was a key collaboration between our scientific and technical subcommittee and our public health subgroup. This last strategy, investing in climate-ready infrastructure, recommends investing in climate-ready infrastructure to better adapt to climate change, like making sure that we understand the vulnerability of our statewide assets, including transportation infrastructure, culverts, drinking water systems, stormwater management systems, and much more. This ensures that both our communities and sensitive habitats that are affected by these types of infrastructure are better able to adapt to climate shifts and impacts from things like sea level rise and changing precipitation patterns. So what are the next steps? We have a state climate action plan, but the state agencies and legislature are the ones who really are charged with implementing this plan. So in the long term, the Maine Climate Council, supported by my office, will be really focused on reporting metrics around the progress in this plan. Our Department of Environmental Protection has already put out a greenhouse gas inventory with our gross emissions, so what we're putting out into the atmosphere every 2 years. And moving forward, they'll also begin reporting on what we estimate we're sequestering or drawing out of the atmosphere. As I mentioned before, the Climate Council is going to be meeting quarterly, and working groups and subcommittees will continue to meet every 6 months. And we'll have a new plan every 4 years. So this is really an ongoing process between the Climate Council, stakeholders, legislature, and the state agencies. So Governor Mills' administration has several priorities that we're focusing on in this next legislative session, including energy legislation and solar program adjustments, Clean Transportation Roadmap Plan and Executive Order, the Executive Order launching the Forest Carbon Program and Task Force, resiliency planning, particularly around sea level rise, leading by example, reducing hydrofluorocarbons or super greenhouse gases, and much more. A lot of the projects that we'll be focusing on implementing are those that help Maine get back to work from the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly help us improve our infrastructure to be more ready for the long term. So this will include a robust bond package that Governor Mills will be releasing within hopefully in the next couple of weeks, that will address things like developing a municipal infrastructure program, particularly focusing on providing state and local matching funds so that we can attract FEMA dollars into the state, federal dollars to fund projects, doubling the pace of weatherization in the state, which helps support local efficiency projects, as well as our goal of doubling clean energy and efficiency jobs by 2030, investing in state and local infrastructure, workforce training, and natural working lands initiatives like funding the Land for Maine's Future program more robustly. So I think with that, I'm going to skip forward to some recent federal action. There has been a lot of movement at the federal level, with President Biden signing many climate change related executive orders, making changes at state agencies. So there are a great deal of opportunities, both from just the end of last year in the Congress, like the reauthorized Land and Water Conservation Fund, significant energy legislation, and some new FEMA storm program funding that provide some opportunities in the near term that Maine can take advantage of to help fund the implementation of the climate plan and helping municipalities fund their planning and implementation of projects. And we're also excited to see that they followed Maine's example in setting a 30% conservation goal for federal lands and waters. We're also excited that they have President Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement that will take effect, I believe, at the end of this month. So there's a great deal of movement at the federal level, and my office and state government are closely working with our federal delegation, our congressional offices, to ensure that Maine can take advantage of these federal opportunities in the coming months and years. So with that, I think I'm going to go forward to my last slide, which is how to stay engaged and up to date on the Climate Council process if you're interested. We provide information through our website, climatecouncil.maine.gov, as well as the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future website. I'll drop a link in just a minute to that. You can sign up for our newsletter. We are ramping up our newsletter to come out probably every couple of weeks in the coming months, letting you know about upcoming meetings, meeting recordings, as well as interesting reading and opportunities if we could become aware of them. And you can also follow us on social media. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Cassaundra. That was wonderful. We do have some questions. The first is, the state is providing guidance through a plan. What actions are they taking with state budgeted resources? And have they budgeted monies to help private and public organizations to achieve these goals?
So right now, all of the state agencies are reviewing the climate action plan to identify where we can take advantage of existing programs and resources to try to implement different parts of the plan. In addition, they're trying to identify where new resources might be necessary to implement different parts of the plan. And over time, significant investment will be required for some of these parts of the plan that require additional dollars that might help, that would help us to attract private investment, but also to bring federal investment into the state. So some of the governor's bond packages should help with that. In particular, there are strategies that try to help provide resources and technical support to communities and different industries, like some of our natural and working land users, to provide guidance to them to help put some of these goals into action at that level. So in the coming months, we should have a clearer picture on what the actual implementation is shaping up to be. So it's a work in progress. It was just finished 2 months ago. So it's definitely going to be a great ramping up as we move forward through this year.
Thank you. And can you expand on the fact that both Maine's climate plan and the Biden administration set goals of 30% by 2030 and how those might work together?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was partially informed by a United Nations biodiversity goal of that's informed by the state of the science on what's required to help preserve global biodiversity in the face of climate change. And so some of the scientifically informed recommendations indicate that we need to protect 30% of lands globally by 2030 in order to preserve some of our most vulnerable ecosystems and species from the impacts of climate change. In Maine, we do already protect a good deal of land, and there are a lot of great conservation initiatives and also management by different landowners and managers. So at the state level, we worked with stakeholders and set a goal within the Climate Council to try to achieve this 30% by 2030. And that kind of happened to coincide with the federal goal. And I believe that the federal goal is really guided by that United Nations scientific report suggesting that as a target.
Thanks. And how do you anticipate that the Mills administration will work to take advantage of the increased funding available under the Great American Outdoors Act?
That I wouldn't say I'm terribly conversant with it, but I do know that my office and the Department of Agriculture and Conservation and Forestry are looking closely to work with our federal delegation on taking advantage of any and all opportunities. So I don't have a lot of detail on that, but I will say that we're trying to take advantage of all the opportunities possible with the resources that we have available.
Great, thank you. And how could AMC members best engage in helping to see the plan implemented?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, as a state employee, not giving direction or or directions to anybody. But I would say, following along with the Climate Council process is great. There is a lot of action or proposed legislation in the state legislature, and the state agencies will also be later this year and in the next couple of years proposing changes to rules. So I think just as a general citizen, paying attention to the process, communicating what you care about to your representatives and the state agencies. I think there are a lot of opportunities where we're hoping to get public feedback to know what is what's going to be helpful and what your priorities are and what you would like to see achieved. That's always a great help in the process at state government to hear from the public about what you care about and what you would like us to work on.
Thank you. And we had another question come in, which is, if the majority of emissions is coming from vehicles, how can I help to create more bicycle paths and corridors?
What a great question. So I believe a lot of bicycle paths, and I would just say zoning and transportation infrastructure in general is decided at the local level. So signaling to your town managers, your town councils about, again, what you care about, what your priorities are. I know that there are often a lot of committees at the local level that make recommendations to their city councils. And so I would say looking into what opportunities there are to provide your perspective and maybe provide some research assistance seem like a great way to get started with that. And reducing how many vehicle miles we're traveling is absolutely a part of that transportation strategy of the climate plan. So great idea there.
Thank you. Which raises for me the question of the Transportation Climate Initiative. AMC across the region supports the Transportation Climate Initiative. Maine has not yet signed on. Is that something that you anticipate the Mills administration will support, and how can we help?
So our transportation working group and our Department of Transportation have been monitoring this closely. We haven't had a memorandum of understanding to respond to. I apologize, I'm not closely involved with monitoring that. So I'm not sure if there's a current memorandum of understanding, but I will say that the Mills administration through our Department of Transportation has been monitoring and participating in those conversations as an observer. And so we will absolutely be involved and hopefully have an MOU to respond to. We want to make sure that that any potential action that the state of Maine takes is not something that's really overly burdening our very large rural population as one concern. The Transportation Working Group did not come to consensus on whether or not to recommend anything having to do with TCI. So there's a little bit in their report of discussion on all sides about that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Dr. Rose? I am not seeing any more. I think this has been really informative and very helpful. And we look forward to working with you to get this further implemented.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your attention today. It was lovely to be here with you. Please all stay warm, stay safe, take care, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some of you on the Appalachian Trail at some point.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.